This is the War Memorial in Stratford, Ontario, and it's typical of all the war memorials across Canada, in every village, in every town, and in every city. And these memorials are gateways to the First World War. Unfortunately, most Canadians have forgotten the First World War, and they don't realize that it was the greatest and most traumatic episode in our history. 400,000 Canadians went overseas between 1914 and 18, and 60,000 died for king and empire.
The tranquil fields of Flanders, just outside of Ypres in Belgium, so tranquil that it is difficult to believe that total war was born here, and here a whole civilization lost its innocence. But in these fields, 500,000 men died. 100,000 still lie beneath this ground. The farmers will tell you, each year when the poppies bloom, the spring rains wash the bones to the surface. Reminders of a great war that began here, on the fields of Flanders. August 1914. Making his bid for mastery in Europe, William II, the German Kaiser, sends 1 million troops pouring into Belgium and France. Great Britain delivers an ultimatum to Germany: leave Belgium or else. The ultimatum expires without receiving an answer, and when in London, Big Ben strikes 11 on the night of August the 4th, 1914, the British Empire is at war. War. At the speed of light, that one word flashes over telegraph wires to the farthest reaches of the empire: Australia, South Africa, India, and Canada. Immediately, Canada offers England an expeditionary force of 20,000 men and calls for volunteers. And in Edmonton, Alberta, a 22-year-old journalist, Harold R. Peat, eagerly answers the call.
The first feeling of pride came over me, and I'm sure over all the boys, on that eventful night in August, when thousands of people, friends and neighbors, lined the roadside as we marched to the station. Strangely enough, no one was crying. Everyone was cheered. Little did the hundreds of those women, those mothers, dream that this was the last look they would have at their loved ones. Men were cheering. Women were waving. Weeping was yet to come.
As they leave their children and womenfolk behind, the volunteer journalists, bank clerks, and farm laborers are keen to fight, but know nothing of war. City parks stand in as battlefields, and regimental drums pretend to be German artillery. While the Canadians play at war, the real war rages in Europe. When the German armies plunge deep into Belgium and France, the British, Belgians, and French struggle frantically to stem the German tide. In 2 months, the Allies fight the Germans to a standstill. By Christmas 1914, 500,000 men have been slaughtered to create a stalemate, a 460-mile deadlocked line of trenches known as the Western Front. Setting sail towards the battlefields of Europe, the Canadians treat the voyage like a holiday. As soon as they set foot in France, they're ordered north to Belgium and the city of Ypres. In Belgium, the Germans had made one last desperate attempt to break through the deadlock. That struggle left a bulge in the Allied line around Ypres, a bulge known as the Ypres salient. When Harold Peet and his fellow rookies arrive in the salient, their eagerness turns to trepidation as they stare towards the German lines.
The first night in the trenches, we fired more bullets than on any other night we were at the front. It was an awful night that first night in. Stare ahead into the dark anywhere, and something will move. My imagination at least supplied the Germans. We had our eyes set and we peppered away. An English officer strolled by. "What the blinkety-blank are you shooting at?" "Me, sir?" "Me, sir?" "Germans, sir."
Soon, Private Peet will see a real battle. But for now, the Canadians merely hold the line, and that is dangerous enough. The Germans press on the salient from 3 sides, and their artillery can target every inch of the Canadian positions.
This is Vormezile Enclosure Number 3 Cemetery, and it's here at Vormezile that the first Canadians came into the line in the First World War. It started in these peaceful fields. This is the grave of the first Canadian killed in the First World War. He was killed near here on the 8th of January 1915. Lance Corporal H.G. Bellinger, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 8th of January 1915, age 39.
Killed by a German shell after only 2 days in the front line, Lance Corporal H.G. Bellinger is only the first of many. For the salient is about to become the most dangerous place on the Western Front. A few days after the Canadians arrive, German guns surrounding Ypres open fire. The Germans had decided to capture the medieval city, the symbol of Allied and Belgian resistance. Freshly arrived in Ypres is Canon Frederick Scott, a 54-year-old Army chaplain from Quebec City who was volunteered with the 1st Canadian Division to minister to the wounded and dying.
It was a bright and lovely spring morning when the whole Canadian Division began its fateful journey to Ypres. Some of us went into the cathedral. The roof was more or less intact, the altar and pulpit in their places. The cloth hall had been burned, but the beautiful stone facade was still undamaged. We had several celebrations of the Holy Communion. It was the first Easter spent away from home. It was the last Easter that most of these gallant young souls spent on earth.
This is the Cloth Hall, one of a number of medieval buildings in Ypres that were used by the Germans throughout the war for range finding for their artillery. At the beginning of the war, buildings like this would have been untouchable. But as the war progressed, the Germans would basically set them on fire with long-range artillery shells. And in 1914, the Cloth Hall and a number of the cathedrals around here caught fire. And it really signaled part of the change in the attitude towards war, where from now on, anything was a fair target.
With almost all of Belgium occupied by the German army, Ypres is overflowing with refugees.
I heard the ripping sound of an approaching shell. It grew louder, till at last a terrific crash told us that the monster had fallen not far off. A number of people crowded into an adjoining cellar, where they fell on their knees and began to say litany. It was a pitiful sight. There were old men and some women, and some little children, and a young girl who was in hysterics. They seemed so helpless, so defenseless against the rain of shells. The final and dreadful bombardment of Ypres had begun.
As the giant shells demolish the city, the Germans are massing thousands of infantry in the fields near the village of Langemarck, overlooking Ypres and its Canadian defenders. 6 months before, in these same fields, the first German assault on Ypres had ended in catastrophe, when the German High Command threw thousands of untrained troops against British regulars. Tens of thousands of Germans died, including 25,000 university students who had eagerly signed up in the first days of the war.
This is Landmark German Cemetery, the largest German cemetery around Ypres. And we're really here to illustrate the point of failure of the Germans in their attempt to capture Ypres in 1914. And nothing illustrates this point more than a cemetery containing more than 44,000 German soldiers, including a mass grave here containing almost 25,000 Germans, predominantly killed in 1914 when the Germans tried to capture this area. Each one of these blocks lists the names of roughly 500 German soldiers who were killed around Ypres and are buried in this mass grave. You can see by looking on the list that a number of them were killed in the First Battle of Ypres, where the German soldiers were shot down by the hundreds by British riflemen and machine gun fire. Many of the troops were very young, and it was actually christened at Kindermorden by the Germans, meaning the death of the children. One of them here is a Franz Huber, who was killed in the battle in October 1914. It was one of those hundreds that were shot down coming across the salient. There's lots of tramp metal in this field. You can actually see it all over the place from exploded shells. Here's a piece here that's a shell fragment. Here's a piece of barbed wire. Here's a shrapnel ball. It's not uncommon to find them just sitting on the surface this time of year. And shrapnel, the shell would be full of probably 200 or 300 of these little balls, and it would be fused to blow up overhead so that the little balls would be fired out in an area, a wide area, and it's used as an anti-infantry device and also to try to cut barbed wire. This piece would be from a high explosive shell probably, and the shell, which is a big piece of cast iron like that, would just be blown to smithereens up by the explosion. Needless to say, these items caused the most number of casualties in the Great War. The fields around Landmark were littered with the dead of the German army and the French and the British. And through the winter, those corpses just lay there. So when the Canadians came out in April 1915, they found many of them still lying there. What the Canadians didn't know was that the Germans were massing for a new attack, and they were going to use a new secret weapon.
April 22nd, 1915. The Germans are preparing to attack Ypres using a weapon never before used in war. In 1915, one of Germany's leading scientists, the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Chemical Institute, Dr. Fritz Haber, hits upon the idea of using chlorine as a poison gas. Working with scientists at IG Farben Chemicals, Fritz Haber transforms chlorine into a weapon of war. Using rudimentary gas masks and experimenting on their own troops, the Germans discover that chlorine ruptures the lungs. If a man breathes chlorine, he will drown in his own fluids. Germany now has its new secret weapon. Specialized troops, what German soldiers jokingly call the stink pioneers, bury over 5,000 canisters of chlorine in the German parapets, facing the French and Canadian line. The Canadians have just arrived. They are about to experience their first real battle and the first mass poison gas attack in history. Fritz Haber's experiment will be called Operation Disinfection.
We're on what were the German front lines on April 22nd, 1915. It was here that the Germans released the chlorine gas on unsuspecting French troops and on the newly arrived Canadians. It was here that the Germans changed the whole concept of warfare, and it's here that total war started, right on these fields.
As dawn breaks on April 22nd, 1915, German long-range guns step up their bombardment of Ypres. 4 miles away from their lines along the north side of the salient, the Canadians watch Ypres burn. Next to the Canadians, French colonial troops from North Africa hold trenches protecting Pilkem. The Canadian lines extend in front of the village of Saint-Julien. In the German lines at Langemarck, the troops wait to attack. With thousands of others, one young German stink pioneer nervously prepares to release the poison gas.
I'll never forget that day in the middle of April. The weather had to be just right. No rain that would wash the gas out of the air. A wind of 12 to 18 miles an hour was ideal, blowing towards the French lines. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. We should have been going on a picnic, not doing what we were going to do. We opened the valves with the strings about supper time. The gas started towards the French. Everything was stone quiet. As this great cloud of green-gray gas was forming in front of us, we suddenly hear the French yelling. Every field artillery gun, every machine gun, every rifle that the French had must have been firing. I had never heard such a noise. The hail of bullets going over our head was unbelievable, but it was not stopping the gas. The wind kept moving the gas towards the French lines. We heard the cows bawling and the horses screaming. The gunfire starts to quiet. After half an hour, only occasional shots. Then everything was quiet again.
Jean Mordac, French commander of the Algerians, hurries forward to see what has happened. His army has disintegrated. He has seen nothing like it before.
It was tragic. Everywhere were fugitives. Infantry without weapons, haggard, greatcoats thrown away or wide open, running around like madmen, begging for water in loud cries, spitting blood, some even rolling on the ground, making desperate efforts to breathe.
In a while, the gas had cleared and we walked past the empty gas bottles. What we saw was total death. The horses, cows, everything, all were dead. The smell of the gas was still in the air. We got to the French lines. The bodies of French soldiers were everywhere. It was unbelievable. You could see where men had clawed at their faces and throats, trying to get breath. Some had shot themselves.
These are the fields that were the flank of the Canadian 1st Division on April 22nd, 1915. The Canadian lines were down that way from where I'm standing, and the French lines went over to the other side. And all through the day on the 22nd, the Germans had been shelling very heavily. So the Canadians knew that something was up, that some attack or something was coming. And they were watching very closely. At about 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., the Germans started to release gas on the French. And from this position, the Canadians could actually see the gas forming up in a cloud and just drifting across the field. And they could see the French running in terror, which really isn't surprising. The Canadians had a couple big problems. One, they had no defense for the gas. There was no gas mask at this time in the war. The second was, the French were vacating their positions, and that meant the flank was wide open.
The gas had ripped open a 4-mile gap in the Allied line. Into this gap, thousands of German infantry advance. Only the Canadians now stand between the Germans and victory at Ypres.
The Canadians immediately, this is to their credit because they were very inexperienced troops, formed up small groups, and they came into this field here and started shooting at the German infantry who were now advancing behind the cloud. The men were primarily from the 13th, the Black Watch, and they included men like Norsworthy and Drummond and Fred Fisher. And they took their small groups of men out in this area and kept shooting at the Germans until they attracted so much attention that the Germans turned around on them.
Guy Drummond, a Montrealer, already a millionaire at 26, a member of the best clubs in the British Empire and a friend of the British Prime Minister. Guy rushes into a muddy beet field to rally a few surviving Algerians. With him is Edward Norsworthy, a dashing stockbroker, used to gambling with his own and other people's money. Now, Norsworthy gambles his life, leading the Canadians and Algerians against the advancing German infantry.
Major Norsworthy sprang to the front and called out, "Come on, men! Remember that we are Canadians and all the eyes of Canada are upon us." And we all followed him with a wild cheer and advanced to the ditches along the road, facing the advancing Germans. The ditches gave us some little protection, and we stuck it there to the last man.
in 1919 when they were clearing these battlefields and taking all the remains into the military cemeteries. They came across a wooden cross that said 2 unknown officers of the Royal Highlanders of Canada, and they dug them up, and they found a femur of one of them was so large that it had to be an enormous man, and Drummond was about 6'3", so they could actually identify that it was Guy Drummond, and they knew that Norsworthy had been buried with him. So the 2 of those men were taken to Tynecott Cemetery and reburied and identified.
Further south, Major William King rushes his 3 18-pounder field guns into an orchard just behind the Saint-Julien Road. He opens fire, sending deadly shrapnel shells that explode over the German troops. At dusk, the Germans charge King's battery, but a 19-year-old school cadet, Fred Fisher, brings a machine gun forward to cover King's retreat. With all 4 of his crew dead, Fisher pushes the gun further forward and keeps firing.
Even Fisher himself was killed later on, although he was awarded a Victoria Cross for his action. I don't think these men knew enough to run away. I certainly would have run away. These were inexperienced troops. They had never seen anything like this, and they made an immediate decision to stand and fight, which is really quite incredible when you think about it, because the odds were totally stacked against them. They were proud of their heritage. They'd been raised on the stories of the British Empire, of Kipling, and a good Englishman didn't run, and they considered themselves to be good citizens of the Empire.
North of Ypres, attached to a Canadian artillery battery, is a brilliant doctor, 42-year-old John McCrae. One surgeon described the scene as McCrae and the other surgeons struggled to keep up.
There are wounds here, wounds there, wounds everywhere. Legs, feet, hands missing. Faces horribly mutilated. Bones shattered to pieces.
We're at John McCrae's dressing station. It was here on the night of the 22nd, when the attack was 5 or 6 hours old, that McCrae was tending to the wounded coming back from the front. This entire area was chaotic. There was Belgian refugees trying to get out of the fighting. There was troops going to the front. There was artillery. This entire situation was completely out of control. Well, we're right inside McCrae's dressing station. He operated here for more than 2 weeks, and I don't know how many hundreds of men he would have treated. Many of them would have been gas cases. The suffering of the men affected him deeply, and throughout the war, he never forgot this experience. But the one that got him the most was on May the 1st, 1915, when his good friend Alexis Helmer was hit by a German long-range shell.
The shell had blown Alexis Helmer to pieces. His fellow gunners collected the remains, placed them in sandbags, put these in a blanket, and pinned the blanket together, trying to give it something approximating a human shape. While the guns of the battery fired without ceasing, John McCrae recited the Anglican service from memory. It was night. Even a candle would draw German artillery fire. Alexis Helmer was buried in darkness.
This is Essex Farm Cemetery. It was established during the Second Battle of Ypres, and the original burials were for those soldiers who died on the way to the front or died at the dressing station. It was overlooking these fresh graves that McCrae wrote in Flanders Fields.
In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields.
That very night, the Canadians prepared to pick up McCrae's torch and make a desperate counterattack against the advancing Germans. As night deepens on April the 22nd, the German attack draws closer to Ypres. The big guns batter the city. Fires spread. People flee in panic. Ypres is about to fall, and Canon Frederick Scott looks on in horror.
I said to myself, has old England lost the war after all? My mouth became suddenly dry as though filled with ashes. That was one of the most awful moments in my life. Some men came marching up the canal. I called out, "Where are you going, boys?" The reply came glad and cheerful. "We're going to reinforce the line, sir. The Germans have broken through." "That's all right, boys," I said. "Play the game. I will go with you."
This area had been broken open completely on the 22nd, and all through the ridges ahead of us, there was German troops digging in and moving in and taking advantage of the gap created by the French colonial troops. There were still some Canadian reserves, and that's what happened here. They brought forward 2 battalions of Canadian reserves to go and take the Germans and capture Kitchener's Wood. On the night of April 22nd, 1915, the situation was desperate, and the High Command knew that they had to seal the gap the Germans had created, or Ypres would be lost. They ordered all available men forward to the attack, and in this field they ordered 2 Canadian battalions, the 10th from Alberta and the 16th Canadian Scottish, to come to this field and capture Kitchener's Wood. And really they didn't even know where Kitchener's Wood was.
The German commanders order their troops to dig in for the night at Kitchener's Wood and prepare for the final assault the next day. The Germans do not know that nothing stands between them and Ypres. Just a few thousand Canadians.
They were actually given an impossible task. They had never seen the positions. It was a night attack. They had never been in battle. They had actually no opportunity at all for success. They had no chance for success. That's why their feat that night is actually so remarkable.
An officer came down and told us that the Germans were in the wood, which we could see before us at some distance in the moonlight. I passed down the line and told the men, "It's a great day for Canada, boys." Those words afterwards became a watchword, for the men said that whenever I told them that, it meant that half of them were going to be killed.
Well, they marched for about half of the way. The Germans, for some reason, didn't pick up on them, and we're talking about 1,600 men. Then all of a sudden, one flare came up from the wood, and then a dozen more, and it was lit up like day, and the Germans opened fire.
Men on each side of me were crying out in pain, and still we went on. I personally felt I must surely be hit. The hail of bullets was so thick. The cracking of the bullets close to the ears made them sing, and it was impossible to make oneself heard even to one's nearest neighbor.
The struggle became a dreadful hand-to-hand conflict. We fought in clumps and batches, and the living struggled over the bodies of the dead and dying. The clashing bayonets flashed like quicksilver in the moonlight.
It was all so mixed up, you just didn't know for anything. And a great big German stepped out, and he may have been going to surrender, I couldn't tell you. But I pulled the trigger and ran.
Well, they captured the wood and they secured it, but by 4 o'clock in the morning they had to leave it. Their flanks were up in the air, and they could not hold it anymore. They withdrew from the wood and dug in across these fields. There were about 1,500 men in the initial attack, and about 700 were killed or wounded, just in a couple of hours. We're going to try to find Kitchener's Wood Memorial, which should be up here somewhere along this road. It's a very obscure monument. It's a newer one, and one of the hardest to find on the Western Front. This is the Kitchener Wood Monument. It's right in front of this farmer's house. It's in his front yard, really. And it says Kitchener's Wood, 22nd of April, 1915. There's a plaque here at the bottom. During the night of April 22nd, 1915,
after the first chemical attack in warfare, the 10th Battalion Canadians and the 16th Battalion, the Canadian Scottish, retook Kitchener's Wood. It's quite an attractive monument in a very difficult location. But there's always some difference between the monuments that were raised by the veterans and those raised by people today. But I guess they say it's better late than never.
As dawn breaks the day after the gas attack, the Canadians follow up their successful assault on Kitchener's Wood. Against overwhelming odds, again and again they attack the German line. Duke Albrecht of Württemberg, commander of the 4th German Army, brings up 34 battalions, 20 of them fresh, to finish off the Canadians, less than 8,000 men. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Saturday the 24th of April, the Germans smash down on the Canadians at the very apex of the salient. First, massed artillery blasts the trenches. Then poison gas floods in. Then behind the gas come 30,000 German infantry.
The trench was a weird spectacle. Men were spitting, cursing, groveling, trying to vomit.
Some officers had already guessed that water with acid in it would dissolve the chlorine.
Piss on your handkerchiefs and tie them over your faces, yells our lieutenant. There are some who do not take this precaution, and they roll about gasping for breath.
The great bulk of our men got down into trenches or ditches or anything low because you avoided bullets by doing that, but you didn't avoid the gas, you took it. And when you saw men suffering, dying with the gas, oh, it was a pitiful thing. I stayed up in the high spots. I would rather have the bullets than the gas.
There are about 200 to 300 men lying in that ditch. Some are clawing at their throats. Their brass buttons are green. Their bodies are swelled. Some of them are alive, still writhing on the ground, their tongues hanging out.
Choking with gas, the Canadians try to hold on. The Ross rifles jam, their obsolete Colt machine guns break down. In pieces of the broken line, the survivors fight on, while the Germans sweep by them, breaking through towards Gravenstaffel Ridge and the village of Saint-Julien.
Well, we're on Gravenstaffel Ridge, which was the scene of ferocious fighting on the 3rd day of the battle. The Germans had broken through Canadian positions on the main road, and it created a large gap. And one of their objectives was to capture Gravenstaffel Ridge. There was very fierce fighting along here as all sorts of Canadian troops, everyone who was available, stood up against the Germans. And you can see by where we're standing why Gravenstaffel Ridge is so important. You can actually see Ypres in the distance. Again, it was another German breakthrough and they had to be stemmed. The advance was just flowing all over the place. They were right at this point fighting with the Canadian troops in St. Julien village and had already surrounded them, in fact. They didn't know that at the time. So the Germans now are pouring through this gap between where we stand and St. Julien village in the hollow.
Each farmhouse, each barnyard, each ditch becomes a slaughterhouse. The Canadians turn each building briefly into a redoubt. In the middle of the fighting for Saint-Julien is Private Harold R. Peat.
Every man was engaged. Cooks, doctors, stretcher bearers, chaplains. Everyone held a rifle. The wounded had to take their chances because there was no way of conveying them back to shelter. As the day passed, 2,000 of us were still in the old position. Still, we held in our safekeeping the road to Calais, to Paris, to London and farther, the key to world power, which the Kaiser coveted.
Later, a bullet ripped through Private Peat's shoulder. For the rest of his life, his right arm was paralyzed. As the battle continues to rage, Canon Scott escorts a convoy of wounded back to the little town of Lamerting, 3 kilometers behind Ypres.
When we reached Flamerting, we were compelled to use the church, and it also soon became a scene of suffering. We had only a few candles with which to light it. The wounded were laid out, some on the floor, some on chairs. Once, the silence was broken by a loud voice shouting out with startling suddenness, "Oh God, stop it!" He was a British sergeant. He would not speak, but I think in his terrible suffering, he meant the exclamation as a kind of prayer. Then I said, "Boys, the curé won't mind your smoking in the church tonight, so I'm going to pass round some cigarettes. Let's have a prayer for our comrades up in the roar of battle at the front. When I say the Lord's Prayer, join in with me, but not too loudly, as we don't want to disturb those who are trying to sleep."
The Germans failed to take Ypres, and Canon Scott follows the exhausted Canadian division as it is withdrawn from the battle. A day later, a German staff officer, Rudolf Binding, rides forward to inspect the battlefield.
April 27, 1915. The battlefield is fearful. One is overcome by a peculiar, sour, heavy, and penetrating smell of corpses. A sleeping army lies in front of us. They rest in good order and will never wake again. Canadian divisions. The enemy's losses are enormous.
At Boulogne, the wounded are evacuated to hospital ships. In 4 days, the Canadians have left 2,000 dead in the fields of Ypres. Shattered bodies are carried up the gangplank, where a few weeks before, eager recruits had disembarked. Ypres is in ruins, but the Canadian division had held the line, and the city is still in Allied hands. The Germans mass for another assault, centered on Bellewaerde Ridge, the last bit of high ground defending Ypres. And holding Bellewaerde Ridge is the only Canadian unit still left in the line, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
Dear Mabel, Galt, Niven, and I sleep in one little dugout. I forget if the baseball bats did arrive. They could very well be used here as a weapon of defense when our ammunition runs out. We now have only 400 fighting men and 7 officers left. It seems to be certain that this line cannot be held, and we are only making a bluff at it. Well, goodbye, old girl. Ever thine, Agar.
Every day, Agar Adamson writes to his wife, Mabel. 48 years old and blind in one eye, Agar was one of the first to sign up with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, a regiment of men who had already fought for the Empire, and which begins the war with the Imperial British Army, not with the Canadian division.
We're on our way to find the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry Memorial that marks their action at Bellewaerde Ridge in the Second Battle of Ypres. It's a particularly obscure monument and really an unknown part of the battle, although it was a very courageous one. We have to go down these little farm tracks to find it. Oh, here we go. Here's some evidence of the First World War. You can actually see that this farmer has used both German and British corkscrew stakes in his fencing here. This is a German barbed wire stake, and you can tell because it doesn't have the top to it. I mean, it's a little electrified. And also the one over here is an English one, and you can tell by the way the piece shoots up at the top. The bottom is a big corkscrew, and then at night they'd go out to no man's land and screw them into the ground and string the barbed wire. And there must have been millions of these things left around here after the war. We're just coming up to one of the most obscure monuments to Canadians in the First World War. It's to the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and it commemorates their action here at Bellewaerde Ridge in May 1915. It's got a very poignant inscription, and it reads, "Here, 8th May 1915, the originals of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, commanded by their founder, Major A. Hamilton Galt, DSO, held firm and counted not the cost." The Patricias suffered more than 400 casualties in this battle, and it took place on that ridge just behind the monument.
Dear Mabel, yesterday, Lieutenant Gao shot badly. 4 men killed, 9 wounded, 2 went mad and had to be disarmed. 6 are in what is called a state of collapse, having been shelled all day and having to remain underground all day. Today, in advanced trenches since last night under very heavy artillery fire. Living in deep ditches. 5 killed, 11 wounded, 1 machine gun smashed to pieces and crews buried and wounded. Gray was badly shot. Ever thine, Agar.
The Battle of Bellewaerde Ridge was a continuation of the Second Battle of Ypres. It's now about 2 weeks later since the gas attack took place, and now the Germans are putting more pressure on the Canadians, and in this case Canadians, and the British forces in the area. Here. This is a 303 bullet, which would be British or Canadian. It's been fired, so you can see the rifling marks in the bullet. Could have been fired in the Battle of Bellewaerde Ridge. We're now on top of the Bellewaerde Ridge, where the fighting actually took place. And here's some leather, either from a boot or from a pouch. Here's a piece of webbing equipment. This would be British. This I can't tell what it is. There's a lot of material up here. Here's another piece. This is a part of a fuse. Looks like from a British shell, an 18-pounder. And you actually can see where they've painted it red along here, along the fuse. The red painted fuses were ones for high explosive, and if they're painted orange, it was for shrapnel. For high explosive, you don't usually find much at all because they'd be blown to smithereens.
At dawn on the 8th of May, in another effort to break through to Ypres, the German guns open a tremendous barrage, and their infantry rushes the Patricias. Watching the attack begin is Corporal Edward Edwards.
At 6:30, the morning stillness was punctuated by a single shell, which broke barely in our rear. And then the ball commenced. They poured in a very destructive enfilade fire which swept up and down the length of the trench like the stream of a hose, making it a shambles. Each burst of high explosive shells, each terrible pulsation of the atmosphere, if it missed the body, seemed to rend the very brain, or else stupefied it.
North of the Prince's Paths, German troops break through the British line and jump into the trenches.
The rest was chaos, pure bit of hell. Men struggling, buried alive, and looking at us for the aid they would not ask for. Soldiers all. But as the Germans came on, they trampled our dead and bayoneted our wounded.
After 17 hours of non-stop fighting, the Prince's Paths repulse the final German assault. The Battle of Bellewaerde Ridge is over. Of the 550 Pats who began the day, 150 are left at the end. Severely wounded, Agar Adamson is evacuated to England.
Here's a little bit of a find. This is looks like a iron potato, but really it's a British Mills bomb from the First World War. It's unexploded, obviously. It's live, not particularly dangerous, but this would have been left over from the fighting probably in 1915 or in 1917. It's not unusual to find these in the fields around here. Today, Bellewaerde's really known for its amusement park, and you can hear the sounds of the roller coasters and the drop of doom right now. People come to Bellewaerde to have fun. No one remembers this battle.
At Kitchener's Wood, at Saint-Julien, at Bellewaerde Ridge, Canada's amateur soldiers had come through their baptism of fire and saved the city of Ypres, but at a terrible cost.
They were very proud of what they had achieved in stopping the Germans, but I don't think anyone really had any idea that they would have this sort of casualties. 2,000 killed over a weekend was not like any other war that had ever been.
The Allies expressed outrage at Germany's use of poisoned gas, but within months they used it themselves. And in the war, poisoned gas scarred, maimed, and killed well over 1 million men.
The Second Battle of Ypres was Canada's first great battle in the Great War. They had suffered tremendous casualties, but they had succeeded in holding the Germans, and it was here at St. Julian that Canada chose to commemorate her fallen. This monument, the Brooding Soldier, was unveiled in 1923, and it was so emotional that it's the only place where they used this sculpture. This panel states, "This column marks the battlefield where 18,000 Canadians on the British left withstood the first German gas attacks, the 22nd to 24th April 1915. 2,000 fell and lie buried nearby. There would be a lot more bloodletting before the war was over."